Hello everybody, this is For the Masses podcast. Today we're with Vijay, who you may or may not recognise. Today we're going to be talking about a topic, what to do when you disagree with society, or alternatively the law, disagree with the social norms, let's say. Vijay and I thought this would be a good topic to speak about, especially in relation to what just happened on the 6th of January, just before Biden's inauguration, the storming of the Capitol building in the United States. Most people found this unacceptable. It seems like the consensus was that this is an unacceptable breach of political and social norms. But again, it's one of these things as where do we draw the boundary? Why do we feel instinctively that way? And why should we feel instinctively this way? Or should we even feel instinctively this way? Vijay, initial thoughts?
Well, my feelings about capital are quite complex, but I think for the sake of the podcast, I nurture a vaguely pro capital writer's stance. So I think there is a line of reasoning where we can see what they're doing is perfectly legitimate, in keeping with a certain understanding of how protest works and what it should do. And I think, for the sake of the discussion, I'm going to adopt that stance. So I'd like to begin by saying, I disagree heartily with the motives of the Capitol rioters or protesters. I'm going to call them protesters because, for this purposes of this discussion, I'm pro-protesters in the Capitol. But I think they're within their rights, under a certain sense of what their rights are to do what they did. So that's like the foregrounding thought. Actually, let's take a step back from our disagreement with the people and with their politics. I think what they did might be a little extreme, but definitely wasn't as far beyond the pale as it's made out to be.
Just a very quick comment on that, just to draw a distinction out. I mean, one of the things which I instinctively think that potentially this is a certain overreach, and I think one of the reasons why I think many conservatives and Republicans in the United States also think that this might be a little too far, is that there was a degree of violence, albeit non-organised violence, involved in the protest, and 5 people did sadly lose their life. Do you think violence in protest means anything? B, do you think there's I think there is a difference, but do you think there's maybe a qualitative difference between organised and non-organised violence, which potentially makes one acceptable? I think that it's a far-fetched to potentially call Trump the instigator directly of organised violence on the Capitol itself, but the fact that there were Republicans, pro-gun Republicans, fired up, often sort of motivated by quite strong principles, present in the Capitol, meant that violence was all but really sort of inevitable to some degree. So, I mean, I think that that's potentially something that we need to think about a little bit more, is that I think that one of the reasons why people disagreed with this so thoroughly was that it was violent. Do you think there's any merit in that? And do you think the distinction that I've drawn out is organised versus non-organised violence is the way that we should be thinking about it? Because it's a very different thing to a coup, I think.
Yeah, well, I think that much is definitely true, but I think we should... I think there are a couple of things there. The first is everybody is indeed blaming Trump. Cynically, I think that makes a lot of sense, right? Because this guy is going to leave the presidency. There is no doubt about that. He is not going to be in the White House in a month's time. So to blame this all on Trump, I think makes a lot of sense. From a cynic's perspective, it was about this guy's gone, cool, move on. I think that's not true, right? I mean, did he encourage it? Did he support it? Did he, at the very least, not say, stop, go away? Yes. Did he mastermind it? I don't think that's the case. But in terms of the violence, I think the first thing is to look at the most recent protests in America. The last time I was, glued to the television watching unfolding violence was the Black Lives Matter protests back in June. there was violence as well. But interesting to note there, right, that the extreme stories we'd hear would be about kids or getting like getting violently attacked, getting injured, getting wounded, getting killed. Here, the drama is just people are dying at all. So I think the first thing to note is the discrepancy there. Maybe we are used to violence and protest. Actually, it's nothing new. It has been around for a long time. There were great eras of peaceful protest in India, in America, but there have also always been constant violent protest. So I don't think we should be as well. Obviously, it is a tragedy that people have lost their lives in this way. I don't think we should make. I don't think we're being consistent if we are extremely worried about 5 people who died in a single protest at Capitol Hill and aren't as concerned about the death tolls, which often, far exceed that 5 from other protests.
I would.
I think we've got.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think this is a double standard that's often been called out in sort of. The thing about double standards is that they often work two ways. If you call out, for example, Trumpists for calling out violent protests back in June, July, but then say that they're being hypocritical when it comes to this protest, which I think was sort of a bit violent, like slightly less violent. I think you're certainly right, but I mean, like, I think that I think that it's also like, as you say, I think that it is a double standard if you're going to defend what happened in the Black Lives Matter movement, where actually there was a bit of violence, certainly a bit of violence, probably a bit more than. It's not a quantitative thing, but there was a bit more violence, I would say, and
I think.
and then you criticise Trump, and you are defending the Black Lives Matter movement. It's hypocrisy from both sides, but I mean, it's not often seen as that. I think you're either sort of defending one way of looking at things or the other, and calling out the other person's hypocrisy from either camp.
Yeah.
Potentially, this is the right way of thinking about things, at least a reasonable way of thinking about things. I think that potentially, I mean, there's a lot of assumptions, I think, about the way in which I think progress works generally across the West, and particularly sort of with a liberal interpretation of history, that basically accepts that protest in the face of injustice is necessary, and that often extra legal measures are necessary in extreme circumstances, and the fact that eventually, because of the fact of progress, they will be justified in the future, i.e. that your belief justifies the eventual end goal. I mean, taking that to an extreme, I think you can see sort of a tension with the existing system, I suppose. So, I mean, where do you think we draw the line? Because I think that it is certainly the case, for example, with some liberal interpretations of how progress and protest should work, that sometimes extrajudicial measures are necessary if there is sufficient injustice. So, for example, with the suffragettes movement, it would be accepted that maybe burning down the Prime Minister's house was retrospectively given the stamp of approval by history and therefore seen as a just act. Do you think there's any truth in those claims, or do you think that we are being inconsistent by claiming these things?
The question is about the idea of protest. I'm going to make it quite abstract here. In general, what justifies protest as a recourse in society? I think what the justification is, it comes from 2, maybe 3 claims. The first claim is, look at our society and the systems in our society. They can get things wrong. And they can get things quite badly wrong, and it might be because they are corrupt, it might be because they have some kind of blind spot, whatever. But they can get things badly wrong. And so you admit this. Then you say, individual people, because protests are made up of individuals, have a certain kind of knowledge, meaning that they can get things right. So where the system doesn't know a fact, individual people can. The right to protest, in a sense, is this third fact. There should be a way, when enough people believe the system has this blind spot, for the people themselves, and in most democracies, obviously, they are kind of like fundamentally the governing body. They are the rulers. It's just, devolved upwards, to be able to correct the system. And the question is, the issue is that there can be no constraints whatsoever upon the knowledge people have, right? Because if we do add those constraints, then those constraints, and then
Sorry, those constraints. Sorry, those constraints. What? Those constraints.
Those constraints have to be enshrined in some kind of system.
Yeah.
Right? And when we add that, when we say, look, you have to protest if you can pass this exam, which explains why you're right to protest, can ask for a pass of some kind, then it's still part of the system, right? But that's not the idea, right? When we came to this idea of protest, abstractly it said it's got to be this time the system fails.
Yeah, because presumably. Sorry, no, you go first.
Looked at individuals, right? The question of do you know that you're right? There's no way of telling. I, as an outside observer, cannot say if a given protest is right. I can say I agree, I think these people have a point, I can say I disagree, but I can't discuss its validity per se, because obviously the idea of protest, as I understand it, is extrajudicial in this specific way that means the rightness or wrongness, the veracity or falsehood of the claim or claims that are being put forward by protesters cannot be determined, cannot be ascertained through systematic analysis, because the system itself and the failure system are why the protest occurs. So if we turn this whole reasoning process and we examine side by side the Black Lives Matter protest and then the Capitol Hill protest, and I think this is a justified parallel which is made a lot in the media. Now the parallel there, I think, focuses on racism and systematic bias and saying, look, if these people were Black Lives Matter protesters, if these people were, black or any other ethnic minority, they would be dead, or there would be a much higher death toll, all these things, which I think are true. I want to put parallels in different directions and say, are these protests justified on the same theoretical model that I've just proposed? And the answer, I think, is the first case, Black Lives Matter, was in part a response to systematic instances of police brutality and the over-policing and more violent policing of black neighborhoods and generally of ethnic minority people in America. So clearly the system has failed, right? And in a very vivid way, you can't go to the system and say, please don't kill me realistically, right? That's what it boils down to. So there is a clear systematic failing. There had been legal methods, there have been requests. I think till this day the case of Breonna Taylor hasn't actually been resolved. So clearly there were legal challenges that failed. So in the first test, has the system got a blind spot? Well, yes, a very significant one. And so then what happens is a lot of people think this is the case, and so they go and they, as individuals with their own personal epistemological structures, with their own ideas, their own beliefs, they go to their state through protest and say, hi guys, we have these ideas, we have these thoughts, listen to us, because you won't in this medium, or in this medium, or in this medium. So that's justified. But the problem is we can apply exactly the same reason to the Capitol Hill protesters, right? Because they have this belief, they have the belief that the election was corrupted, was fraudulent. And sure, the system disagrees. And by the system, I guess I mean, not just
the media as well, let's say. I've sort of got the... carry on.
But also the media.
Yeah.
And so then they say, look, can we make legal challenges? But you can't, right? Because the epistemology of the system is against the epistemology of the individuals, right? The system of knowledge and system is to say there was no corruption. The individuals, on the other hand, believe that there is, and they have a group of them who also share this belief. And so they go and they protest. They want attention. They've got attention, but they've got national coverage, global national coverage, all kinds of coverage. I'm sure in the ISS, they hear Capitol Hill has been breached for the first time in 200 years. So in a sense, in both cases, what we have is the core tenets are fulfilled. A group of individuals have certain kinds of beliefs, certain specific beliefs. These are the kinds of beliefs that they cannot express through the system, which is designed to cope with those kinds of beliefs. In the case of Black Lives Matter, the belief of that there is kind of over-policing, the belief in racial equality, the belief that it needs to be instantiated doesn't happen if you go through the correct legal channels. In the case of the Capitol Hill protesters, you go through the legal channels and they say no, the votes were legitimate. Now, you and I might think, well, actually this over-policing, that's a serious issue. We share the beliefs of the protesters in Black Lives Matter, and I, for one, I think there was no massive fraud. I'm sure you think there was no massive fraud. So we disagree from a kind of factual perspective with those protesters in America, in Capitol Hill. But I don't think we can meaningfully say more than this. I disagree with this, I don't agree with that. And importantly, I don't think we can then say, from I disagree or I agree, they should or they shouldn't. Because my understanding of protest, my framing for protest is, protest exists in this space where there is no rational way that works that can settle these kinds of disagreements.
I think I would agree with you in several important respects, but I think that I look at this classically from my perspective through sort of like a more sort of political lens, and sort of like, I think that you're looking at it in terms of the structures of knowledge. The way in which I'm looking at it in terms is sort of like, I agree that both have a right to protest. I think that the reason why protest exists at a basic level is so that, as with democracy, it's to alleviate tensions within society and provide evidence for the disaffected, so that the government is pressured in order to react in a meaningful way to these calls, these desperate calls, because protest is often a desperate thing, in order to create change. I suppose where I'm sort of coming from this slightly differently is I think that protest, again in either case, should be looked at in terms of protest in the generality should exist in order to alleviate tensions no matter where they are, be it Black Lives Matter protesters or Trumpists believing that the election was rigged, for example. So I do agree with you sort of from that perspective, but I think that as with democracy, or democracy more generally, is sort of an attempt to create as much good for as many people as possible by bringing to the fore, for example, the general good of most people, while at the same time potentially allowing, through complex mechanisms, other people's voice and dissatisfaction to be heard so that the government works for all people. That's imperfect because all political systems are imperfect. And therefore it needs these added mechanisms that we sort of add on and think about and debate over time in order to create a more perfect system of allowing people's voices to be heard. So obviously you had, for example, in the 60s, etc., people being systematically ignored, especially African Americans, and therefore you've got a growing acceptance that maybe protest is necessary. I mean, obviously you had this before because America was founded out of a protest against the king, an extra-legal protest against the king. But I think in sort of its current form, its current formula, the sense that it is integral and necessary for the political debate of the United States currently, it comes from sort of that 60s, we need to protest against the government in order to be heard if we are not heard via democratic means. So I would agree with you, but I think maybe I look at it very slightly differently. Maybe that's just because you're a philosopher, I might be more historian/political scientist. Yeah.
I mean, the differences in perspective, but I think worth noting, just as a side note, it's kind of ironic, right? Like the 2 times that Capitol Hill have been stormed have been because people didn't like their leader. That I think is quite neat. I think the difference in perspective, I think that makes sense, but I think it's important to realise that there's an implicit contradiction in the. Well, I think what you're saying helps to highlight the implicit contradiction in the democratic system, which involves protest, because where does the democracy derive its? The democracy derives any political legitimacy, at least as I see it, from a combination of claims. The first is that representatives can represent individual. Well, it derives from legitimacy, but that relies on 2 further claims. One, the people can be represented by individuals who are, drawn from their ranks but don't encompass all of them. And 2, the methods by which we select those representative officials are the kind of methods that allow for representation to occur. And once we believe those 2 things, then we can have a Congress, or a Parliament, or a Senate, or what have you. But the problem with protest is essentially it's denying the second, was denying really one or both of those 2 claims. It's either saying the methods by which our voices, the protesters' voices are heard, aren't working, so that's the second claim that's denied, that we can't get the right representation, or it's saying those people who purport to represent us don't, because we, the protesters, aren't having our voices heard in the right way in the, House of Governance. And yet democracies always allow, it seems, Western democracies always allow protests. They always, and this to me highlights, the contradiction which I find in democracy, and we can hash this out at length in another podcast potentially, but it's the contradiction which says democracy both claims to be the best system of government and is filled with caveats that make it acknowledge how bad it is. Like the right to protest is antithetical to the concept of democracy in the sense of democracy as government, because democracy as government is founded on the claim that, look, we can govern people by using systems to choose representatives, but protest says, no, we can't. I don't have an answer to that.
Yeah. I suppose I sort of do have an answer to it in a sort of in a funny sort of way, but also maybe sort of my answer is sort of a lack of answer. I think that maybe you're trying to make the legitimacy of the government contingent on these quite basic foundational principles that maybe, for example, democracy is some sort of representative system, self-contained system that always works in the best interests of people because it is structured in that way. I suppose the way in which I see democracy is that democracy is this mushy mesh of sort of a combination of things which we have decided over time give the best way of allowing people's voices to be heard, and that for the whole system to work in the general good of people. And therefore there's no, and this is why, for example, claims to, for example, us having a system which might be more fair, I feel sort of it doesn't really make sense, because democracy is not really about fairness, in my opinion. It's about sort of how well it works, and that's sort of a thing that you've got to try and test over time, because it's about it's about preventing the whole system from collapsing in on itself, and also from generally providing people with a sense that their needs are recognised, and therefore, as a result of those needs being recognised, they feel as if they have some sort of stake and ownership within the system. And those two things I think are really central to democracy. But as you say, I think that obviously both are imperfectly achieved. And I think approaching this in the best way possible is sort of to say that we are creating this system. It's not a perfect system, but it's a system that we can build on to get closer to maybe a more perfect system. So maybe I've got a more sort of pessimistic, but also view of democracy, or the potential of democracy. But I think that my view allows things to potentially progress over time, I suppose, and sort of work our way through it. Maybe we disagree what democracy is, maybe.
Your model is more pragmatic than mine. You know, mine's fairly idealist. So I think that's a dispute which really can't be answered in a podcast or out of one. But I can definitely see the kind of the way in which that approach makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
If you're building a bridge to cross a ravine, you know, the fact that you haven't built the perfect bridge is fine as long as you're not in the water, and as long as we see that as long as we think that the consequences of statelessness anarchy are so bad, I don't, but I think a lot of people do with good reasons, then it makes sense to justify like a perhaps not perfect but functioning state. You know, let's cross the ravine, literally cross the bridge when we come to it. I think that is a kind of fundamental ideological disagreement. It isn't worth hashing out here. But I think turning it back to the question of America, one reason on your kind of uncharitably muddle along view of democracy, we might be so worried by America right now is because both sides, as it were, both extreme sides of the country, can garner significant support in their protest. What we're hearing from Biden, who I think is a centrist in the American sense, so more right-wing than most people in the country here, but, you know...
About as right-wing as me, probably. That's why I like him.
is the soul of America, battle of the heart of America. But what I hear, when I hear these speeches by Biden, is something quite worrying. And maybe I'm, a little bit romanticizing a little bit here, but I ambition to stay very thin, pillar of land upon which Biden stands, saying, this is the heart of America. But at both sides, these forces are, coming in. These protests, these radical movements, gradually becoming more and more mainstream, gradually pulling more and more people. And the centre, as I think it's Yates says, things fall apart, the centre never holds. I don't know what you think about that, but I just wondered if you have a situation where almost all bits of the country are up in arms, quite literally, do you have much faith for the country as a whole?
I suppose that the fact of democracy, and this is also, I think that if you're going to have a system which revolves around the idea of you're enforcing people, when you have democracy, it necessarily, almost a basic condition, means that you're sort of enforcing some people's will on people that don't necessarily want it. I think a necessary condition for that is that you broadly accept that the system works, and I think that the fact that increasingly, but as we need the system people to feel as if the system works, because if they don't feel as if the system works, they've got no reason to participate in the system, they've got no reason to respect the system, and the whole basis of democracy, as I see it, that it responds to people's needs, and it makes people, as a result, have some sense of ownership of democracy that it's working towards them, sort of falls apart. So I would tend to agree with you in that if things sort of these protests become more normalised, I think it potentially poses an existential threat to America in general. I think that what we need to do, or what I would do as a pragmatic politician, is recognise that as a fact and use that fact in order to amend my political agenda, in order to alleviate those pressures. Not necessarily by doing what the protesters ask, but it's often sort of like more basic than that. So, like, for example, I think there's a general crisis in capitalism at the moment where it's like globalization broadly doesn't distribute benefits to people, and that means that people feel as if capitalism and the system's not working for them, and therefore they've got no reason to believe in democracy. Maybe alleviate that. So I think it's I agree with you that democracy in America will break if we keep on going this way. But I don't think it's anything like. I don't think it's because sort of things have become normalized. I just think it's sort of structural problems with. I think it's just structural problems with America in general. Maybe that's sort of tangential, but I think it sort of brings up a point about protest more generally. I think it's sort of often a signifier of dissatisfaction, but often the dissatisfaction itself lies elsewhere, I feel. So, like, I mean, with the Trumpist protesters, like, do they actually feel that, for example, there is potentially this massive widespread voter fraud? Maybe, but if they feel as if a system is rigged against them, and why do they believe that? It's because capitalism as it's currently constituted works against them. Similar to maybe Black Lives Matter protests, they think the whole system is rigged against them because it hasn't paid them enough attention, and in part that's economic, or at least it's made to be economic for complex reasons that I don't really want to necessarily get into now, but you see what I mean. Do you agree?
Yeah, I do. I think I do agree. I think part of that reason is why I'm quite invested now. I mean, I've rarely invested in politics at all. I'm quite interested in Biden. I don't like Biden as an individual. I don't like his politics, but in terms of whether this question, can the American state survive, can the centrist state survive, I think Biden's going to be really interesting because he is, in a sense, he is a centrist right broadly, and he is coming after Trump, but he's also coming into this country which has seen like huge amounts of violence, huge numbers of protests on both sides of the political divide. So I'm invested in Biden to the extent that I'm quite interested to see, can he pull this off? Can he talks a lot of talk about reuniting America. Can he actually do that? Can he find the heart or the soul or whatever it is, and can he pull that together? That would be fun to see. I just want to bring something else up, which is kind of gone under the radar. We have a new world's richest man, and I think that is relevant because it points to. I mean, look. I have very little truck with states in general. I don't think there's any moral justification for the state, but I do think it is worth noting a comparison in terms of, because we're discussing power and representation, and there is none with either Jeff Bezos or now Elon Musk. So there are lots of problems with states, right? But the fundamental contract, if we are contractarians of the state, is you are an individual who has certain rights. Therefore, you participate in my system of the state. And we'll try and get back to you with some, responsibilities, some tax limits, whatever, right? With care, with various social structures. We, the state, will do that for you. The basic contract of Musk's empire or Bezos' empire is we will own you in exchange for these bits of money, most of which you will give back to us. And I just think it's worth noting, that huge discrepancy in the fundamental relationship between these two entities, and it's entirely right. This contest, to me, brought into sharp relief the fact there is an ongoing battle to be, under globalization, more powerful than any state, I think.
Oh, sorry. Do you go ahead? Finish, or do you?
Yeah, and so I think it's not really a point as much an observation, which is, people talk a lot about the alternatives to states. Right now, the most plausible alternatives to states aren't looking too good, because at least the state might fail to recognise your rights, systematically fail to recognise your rights, but at least it believes they exist. You're in a special kind of relation. It's odd, right? Here I am defending the state. I don't defend the state on principle. I don't like it.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know how I feel about states. It's like completely the opposite to you in many ways. It's sort of like um, in the sense that I think the state is natural. I suppose it wouldn't be natural. It wouldn't be natural under the conditions of technology because humans would, I mean, change their behaviour in certain ways if other humans have sufficient amounts of power over them. That being said, I do broadly agree with you about Elon Musk. I think there are some really scary things that he and Jeff Bezos are doing, which they have zero accountability whatsoever in the sense that it is sort of the imposition of one or two people's will onto society and history for the rest of uh, the existence of humanity, and potentially they could potentially unilaterally do something to humanity which is irreversible and fundamentally affects all of us. They have that amount of concentration of power, and because I think they're dressing it up as what they're doing is sort of almost necessarily for the end good of humans, they have sort of this self-justification system, but also the means to evade states because of the nature of both international competition in the sense that we have different borders and people respect people's different borders and therefore they can switch between them, and also the fact that America's never going to clamp down on Amazon because it's sort of in an international game with other people, and it needs to keep Amazon if it's going to keep up with Alibaba in China. So I think there's a few things there. There's pressures which mean that the United States is basically imposing Amazon onto the whole world, and also the United States as an entity, or any country as an entity, might not actually want Amazon's effect on humanity. And it's very hard, I think, to see of any reasonable pressure, any reasonable man-made pressure, which would shut Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos down because they don't want to. I think that it's worrying. So I'd agree with you. Maybe that's. We've got maybe one more thing to discuss because I think we're almost getting to the end. I think, but you were going to say something in response. Maybe we can finish on that.
Yeah, I think. Well, the first thing to say is, there's all this debate or focus about the most powerful man in the world. That's simply not true. Like, the president has checks and balances. These guys, they don't. But I think it is worth just saying. In a sense, right, because we began with the question, the very broad question, what do you do when you disagree with society? And we haven't addressed really the individual very much. We could do that in different podcasts.
Yeah.
I want to address it now. Because in a sense, like, that's what you do. Because Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos have essentially transcended society. Like, lots of writings say, here is the system, and the system is writ large, capital S, it's against you, or at least it's controlling people who aren't you. And there are two options here, right? Either we can go the TJK route, we run off into the forest and send pipe bombs to people. We attempt to leave
I do not endorse
the
that.
system by running away. Or we do what these two individuals have done, which is run the system, right? Get to the top. You aren't affected by. I mean, you are affected by the system. You're not sort of beholden to it if you're running it.
Yeah, and yeah, go on.
I guess to present this kind of final tension, really, which I want to sort of put forward and frame. And I think it's a tension which is running through this discussion about protest. And the question is, because the question about protest is, we think society has gone wrong in these specific respects. We would like to go and take me to your leader through through extra legal means. We'd like to have a chat about that. But there's a deeper question, right, which is what do you do when you disagree with society? As a structure, as a whole, as a system, interlocked, interdependent network of institutions that have invested interest in various things that you deeply disagree with. And there are two answers to that. It seems to me right now there are two answers at least. The two answers are run away
Or run it.
or run it. Right,
Yeah.
run away or run up.
Yeah.
It. But I think we need a third answer. And I mean, this is all very totalizing, all very fatalistic, all very dramatic. But I think it's also justified.
Yeah.
Because the consequence of globalization isn't just that our trade can go around the world, it's also that our influence and our power. And I say our, what I mean really is these technocrats, right, can go all around the world. And I guess like the final thing I want to say is really this. Society is becoming bigger. And it's becoming more technologically adept. It is intruding further into our lives in every sphere. And I don't mean that in a positive or a negative way yet. But what that means is the space to run away is growing thinner. But so is the space to run up. Because, there are people there in your way. You can't run it if there are already leaders. And so I guess the final thing I want to say is, look, these two options are gradually fading away. We can't go to Thoreau's cabin, and neither can we storm the Capitol, but actually escape the British. And in this widening space, there needs to be some kind of middle ground. I don't know what that is. I don't know if you have thoughts about it, but I think
it's a good thought. I mean, maybe we could do this in another podcast. But it's certainly a very interesting thought. I mean, it's sort of quite I suppose Nietzschean in the sense that you either dominate or / you create your own in some regard, i.e. dominate. Either you become your own Übermensch who sort of creates his own values, i.e. run off into the woods, or alternatively you dominate other people, forcing them to recognise you. So maybe that's a sort of parallel. But I don't think Nietzsche has a third answer, and I think that if he's a thinker who's thought about it their whole life and is widely respected as I mean, it doesn't mean there isn't an answer, but it feels as if it might be hard to come by a third answer. Maybe that's just something that we have to live with, is that maybe we've got to, it's going to be a bit harder on sort of a macro level to have that sort of recognition of our own values and that reflection of our own values being written into society more generally. That being said, I think it's time to end this podcast at the very least, because I think I'm gonna have supper. But this has been Vijay. It's been very interesting to talk to him. Sorry about the sound issues. About halfway through, my speaker cut out, meaning that we had lots of technical difficulties. Hopefully I'm fine editing that. Not going to be that fun. But yeah, au revoir.
Thank you.